Hello and welcome to this edition of the World Deciphered, brought to you by the Cipher Brief. I'm your host, Suzanne Kelly. The killing of Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar by Israel is being called one of the most significant events in the year-long war in Gaza. But it's also prompting questions about what comes next. More than 100 hostages kidnapped by Hamas in the brutal terrorist attack of October 7th, 2023, remain captive. And the line of potential successors to replace Sinwar isn't promising when it comes to hopes of negotiating the hostages' release. So what's possible when it comes to what's next in the Middle East? And how might Middle East dynamics be fueling new splinter terrorist organizations? We're talking with former senior CIA officers Ralph Goff and Glenn Korn about that. And then later in the show, Cipher Brief international correspondent Meurmishvili sits down with the former Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, Dr. Michael Vickers, to talk about not just instability in the Middle East, but also how terrorist groups are adopting their tactics globally in response to shifting geopolitical dynamics. If you're following our coverage at thecipherbrief.com, you're likely already read in on our expert-level interviews, including our conversation with former National Intelligence for Iran at ODNI, Norm Rule, on Iran's calculus and risk factors now. We're getting to all of that shortly, but first I want to check in with Cipher Brief Managing Editor Tom Nagorski on the other stories making headlines, both in national and global security this week. Tom?
Hey, Suzanne. Well, the other big story from the Middle East this week involved a letter from Washington. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and Secretary of State Antony Blinken wrote to the government of Israel in a letter that was leaked, saying basically you need to stop starving the people of Gaza, and you need to make sure that more humanitarian aid gets in. The U.S. has made similar requests before, but never in the form of demands, with a 30-day deadline to go with them, and a warning that American aid to Israel could be affected if the demands are not met. U.S. officials told us it wasn't meant as a threat, but it sounded like one. They also wouldn't say what specifically would happen if Israel ignored the requests. And then in the other war in Ukraine, it has been a rough week for Volodymyr Zelensky. The Ukrainian leader was pushing his plan for victory this week to his parliament at home and then to a special meeting at NATO headquarters. And from NATO, as is often the case, he heard warm words, but also a firm no on part one of his plan, an invitation to join the alliance. And then from South Korea's intelligence agency, confirmation that North Korea has sent 1,500 special forces to Russia for training and deployment to Ukraine. The agency also said that over the last year, North Korea has shipped more than 8 million rounds of artillery and rockets to Russia. These are the most tangible examples of how Russia is benefiting from its increasingly close friendship with the regime in North Korea. And again, that's bad news for Ukraine. And finally, while it is no secret that Donald Trump would, if elected, be much less friendly towards Ukraine, it was still a surprise to hear him say in a podcast this week that he blames Zelensky for Putin's invasion. Here's the quote: "I feel badly for those people, but Zelensky should never have let that war start." Zelensky didn't explain how he came to blame the Ukrainian president for Russia's invasion. Back to you, Suzanne.
Thanks very much, Tom. Let's get right to it now. With the killing of Yahya Sinwar and the dynamics in the region reaching what feels like an all-time high since the beginning of this war last year, I sat down with Cipher Brief experts Ralph Goff and Glenn Korn, both former senior CIA officers with considerable experience in the region, to talk not just about what happens now, but what we should expect from other players in the region, including the ones you might not be reading about in the headlines. Thanks for being here.
Good morning.
Hey, good morning, Suzanne. Good morning, Glenn. Good to be here with Cipher.
Good morning, Ralph. Thanks for having us.
You know, the news, once it was finally confirmed by all parties that Sinwar was dead, instantly people started speculating about what this could mean for the war. But I think for people like you who really understand the dynamics of the region, it's clear that no end is really in sight. And now there's even more concern about who might replace him in Hamas. So I want to talk to you first about Hamas? What is the strength of the organization at this point? And who might be willing to step in to take this role, which also comes with target number one designation by Israel? Ralph, you want to kick us off?
So, on Hamas, this is, or I should say, getting back to the original question, what does this mean? I mean, this doesn't mean really anything except a lot of impact on Hamas, a lot of psychological impact on Hezbollah, a lot of psychological impact on the Iranians, a great psychological boost for the Israelis. But in terms of the war, I mean, right now, the only people talking about a ceasefire are the West, right, the external forces. And then, meanwhile, you don't hear anything about ceasefires or peace coming out of other capitals, such as, Tehran and Moscow in particular, the other supporters there. And by the way, Russia has been a long historical ally of Hamas. So, the chances of any kind of immediate ceasefire, I think, are zero. And I think the Israelis will use this time to continue to press their current advantage over these forces. On that, I'll defer to Glenn on the rest there.
Thanks, Ralph. Thank you for raising Russia, because, the Israelis just found a huge cache of Russian-made advanced weapons in a Hezbollah tunnel network, one of their raids on the southern border. So, yes, Russia is a supporter of both Hezbollah and Hamas. So it's just another reminder that this axis of resistance is actually a unified front against probably the values that we have here in the West, I would argue. The Israelis I agree with Ralph. I think they're going to continue to pursue targets. I think they know, when we removed bin Laden from the battlefield, it wasn't over. There was someone that replaced him. And so there will be someone that will replace Sinwar, and the Israelis will continue to go after them as they've done to Hezbollah. From the other side, Hezbollah has already announced that they're going to ratchet up their attacks now on Israel. Everyone is waiting to see what the Israeli response will be to the last Iranian attack on Israel, and I think it's clear the Israelis will do something. They will respond. And I agree with Ralph. I think there's a lot of hope, maybe in the West, that this is an opportunity for a ceasefire. I'm skeptical that we'll see a ceasefire, and I'm worried about the hostages, those that remain alive, because unfortunately I think that probably many of them, if not all of them, are they're not with us, which is a tragedy.
When you say not with us, Benjamin Netanyahu made very clear yesterday that he is continuing to call for the release of those hostages before any progress will be made in terms of Israel lightening up, if you will, on the pressure that they've been applying since that terrorist attack last year. I wonder, in terms of a replacement for Sinwar, many people have speculated that it could be his brother, Mohammed, his younger brother, who has a reputation for being somewhat, I guess, less willing to negotiate. And so the fate of the hostages is very much still getting a lot of attention. What do we know about Mohammed Sinwar? And maybe even the broader question of, for people who don't understand the dynamics in the region, Hamas has been pretty much decimated. And people don't understand that they're also supported in the region by a more powerful player, Iran. So talk me through just a minute how you're seeing Hamas continue to rebuild, to thrive, not to be completely decimated, regardless of these attacks.
Yeah, well, you mentioned the hostages there, and that's crucial. That's the last remaining currency that Hamas has, right? With their leader dead and with succession unclear, the hostages remain the only thing they have left to bargain with. So this is, this is an existential threat to Hamas, right? It's never been worse for them. So, giving up the hostages, it would just seal their fate. So I think, any kind of negotiating for the hostages, the Hamas will be looking for a way to survive, to negotiate each one of those precious lives for the life of their own organization. As far as Mohammed, the brother, he's said to be kind of maybe a meaner version of his deceased brother Yahya, and he was a piece of work. He was he made his name in Hamas by being the internal enforcer in their counterintelligence, and he's responsible for the murder of fellow Palestinians who were, suspected of treason. They may not even have been guilty of treason, but just suspected of treason. And that's one of the reasons why he was locked up in Israeli jails for decades, where, by the way, he became an expert on the Israelis. He learned to read, write, and speak fluently Hebrew, right? He was famous for studying all the books written by Israeli generals and leaders and learning the bios of his opponents, and he was an expert on his opponents as well, right? Which was what made him such a formidable opponent for the Israelis. But in terms of, succession, whether it's Khalid Mashal, who remains outside, and he's a guy the Israelis tried to assassinate him once with poison in an attack in Jordan, right? So meanwhile, while they try to sort out who's in charge, the hostages are all they got. And I think that the succession issue, the Israelis decimated the leadership of Hezbollah, where succession is still unclear. And now with Hamas, succession is equally as unclear there. But succession is less important as to what they do right now with those hostages in order to guarantee the survival of Hamas in the face of what will be an unrelenting Israeli assault.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Glenn, let's talk too a little bit about Iran and Iran's hand in this.
Well, I've said from the beginning last year, the Iranians are behind this. I think they made a strategic miscalculation. They've had their number one piece on the chessboard in the axis of resistance decimated, Hezbollah, which was their pride, considered the most effective militia that they had, their aircraft carrier to strike Israel. Hamas now, as Ralph said, the leadership is decimated. To your question, I don't know how Hamas can, I think it's survival. It's like rebuilding is probably not even on the agenda right now. They've got to survive. And I think that the Israelis, I think Netanyahu, he's said yesterday in his public statements, if I understood what he was saying correctly, is, okay, now's your chance to put down your arms, turn over the hostages, and then we'll let you live. My guess is that he doesn't think that's going to happen, and they are going to continue to pursue these guys. They're going to try and kill as many of them as they can, or capture as many of them. Probably the preference is to just remove them from the battlefield. And the Iranians, I think, are in a very tough situation, because I don't think there's much they can do without starting a bigger war, which I don't think they want, especially before our elections here. I think they're being very careful.
Mm-hmm. And let me ask you, Glenn, you said, unfortunately, you don't think that the hostages are with us. Let's talk about how important those remaining hostages are and the dynamics of what's at play here. Can you tell me a little more about that?
Well, when I say that, I don't have no information on how many are alive or dead. It's just been where they've been held from, I think, what people assess. It's just been taking a beating. I think there are probably different factions now as Hamas leadership starts to splinter, or going to do different things with them. I'm hopeful that the hostages are alive, but I'm afraid, as Ralph said, Sinwar's brother takes over. I don't think he's going to be willing to trade people, or if he is, they're going to demand a high price that the Israelis are not going to be willing to pay. And my guess is that, the effective operations against Hezbollah and now the removal of Sinwar are just raising the popularity of Netanyahu right now. I know there are a lot of Israelis that want the hostages back, but I think it's like a kind of a sugar high when there's news that a guy like this is killed on the battlefield. Mm-hmm. And so we'll have to see, if Hamas now comes out, if the new leader comes out and says, okay, we'll negotiate, hopefully some of the hostages will be returned alive. But we know that some of the negotiations are just for the bodies. Mm-hmm. And again, what Iran is responsible for this, in my opinion, because they helped create Hamas, they funded Hamas, they backed Hamas, and they have a history themselves of kidnapping people or using their proxies to kidnap people, and including Americans in the past, which we shouldn't forget. The Iranian regime, not the Iranian people, the Iranian regime. The
Iranian regime. Yeah, that's correct. And I would add to that, Glenn, Iran is behind all this, but this is a case of be careful what you wish for, because, the Iranians were not aware that Hamas was launching that attack last year on the 7th of October, right? The leaders in Tehran were just as surprised as were anybody else, right? So they kind of lost control of their proxies. And now, the Israelis in just the last few weeks have dramatically turned the tables on the Iranians, right? The Iranians went from feeling smug and having their proxies encircled Israel and were striking them and causing, all kinds of worldwide. It wasn't just damage limited to Israel. The damage was politically around the world, right, as countries came out against Israel. And so, there was the Iranians now are on their back foot. They're waiting for a retaliatory strike by the Israelis. They've launched investigations within the IRGC, right? The head of the Quds Force, Khani, is under investigation, and others, I'm sure, right? Their proxies, the three H's, right? The Houthis, Hezbollah, and Hamas are all under great pressure. I think the Houthis should be taking note of what's happened to Hezbollah and Hamas here, right? Because the Israelis will definitely turn attention to them at some point if once they feel they're done with Hezbollah and Hamas, right? And so, for Iran, they're on their back foot. Meanwhile, Israel also the great cost here. There's all these fighting a war on three fronts is draining their coffers, right? Economic issues coming up. Their reserves are exhausted, right? The industry is suffering, right? Reservists have been away from their jobs for months now. You still have the internal political war inside Israel is kind of on hold, right? Between his supporters and the opposition there, while Israel tries to figure out what kind of country it will be. And meanwhile, the West Bank, right, which has been pushed off the headlines before all this, the headlines of violence in the Mideast centered on the West Bank and struggles between the settlers and the Palestinians. That hasn't gone away either. So, a lot of problems for Israel there as well. So, this is a time where I think both sides should be thinking about how to ratchet things back and recover. But it certainly won't mean the end of things.
Well, what's the likelihood, though, that Benjamin Netanyahu, you mentioned that the Iranians are now on their back foot. I mean, he has been an Israeli leader who has taken every opportunity that he has been given to press forward to protect Israel in the future. What is the likelihood, do you think, that Israel might actually launch an attack against Iran, especially given that the U.S. right now is in something of a wait-and-see mode when it comes to our next political leadership here?
My assessment is that they are going to launch a strike. I think Netanyahu has made it clear that he sees that he has an opportunity to undermine the Iranian regime and to continue to humiliate them. What the bigger consequences, or the wider consequences are going to be for the region and for the U.S. and our allies, in Europe are going to be, it's a big question mark because it could backfire in a big way. But I think that they feel that they have an advantage now, and they're going to press that advantage because they've got to eliminate as much of the threat, which has presented an existential threat to Israel for many, many years, which has been allowed to build and be created. And I think they're trying to take that as much apart as they can. Hezbollah, Hamas in particular. And with the Iranians, I think they will do something. And my prediction is before the elections in the United States.
Yeah.
You think the Iranians will, or the Israelis will?
The Israelis will.
The Israelis will, yeah.
And I think regime change is back on the table, right? Regime change is kind of a big taboo in the past, right? But already with the uprisings we had, over the Kurdish girl who was beaten to death in a jail, right? Now we've got an opportunity here for the Israelis to cause a lot of problems there for the Iranians. With if they launch a strike, if it's carefully calibrated, they can launch a strike that weakens Iran militarily, right? And also gives hope to the people, gives hope to the opposition there that this regime is more fragile than people think, right? So right now, for the first time in decades, Israel and the West have an opportunity here to put regime change back on the table and actually, come together with some sort of strategic campaign to achieve that goal.
Regime change in Iran.
Mm-hmm. To Ralph's point, if I'm in Washington now, people better be thinking about, okay, what is our plan if we start to see destabilization? If Iranians take to the streets and demand change, what are we going to do? Unfortunately, in the past, we've in my opinion, we've failed to seize opportunities to remove the current regime in Iran. Not us, but the people of Iran, to support them in doing that.
Let me just ask you in closing, I want to bring the conversation back to how it started by mentioning the headlines are very different in the West than the sentiment sometimes in the region. There's a disconnect there. And again, I'm very glad that you mentioned the sort of Russian dynamic here, because that alliance, this new growing alliance between Russia and Iran over Ukraine, and of course we can throw in China and North Korea in that alliance as well, has been really impacting the world order, and that's not really an understatement. So I want to ask you, in terms of the dynamics in the region, what are you most worried about right now and between now and January?
Okay, well, let me throw this out there. Look back at history, right? Look at the history of Israel and the Palestinians with the PLO, right? Israel, for years, the PLO was their main enemy, right? And they hit them and they assassinated them. They took out leaders. Right, and what did they get from that? That gave birth to Hamas. It gave birth and strengthened Hezbollah. Right, so now you got the Israelis are pounding Hamas. They're pounding Hezbollah. What's going to come out of that? New organizations coming out. We've already seen it in the West Bank with small splinter groups like Lion's Den and Eagle's Nest. Right, and I've seen videos of these groups where they're all praising Allah, and they sound more like ISIS than they do like Hamas. Right. So I think the big fear here is, out of the wreckage of Hezbollah and out of the wreckage of Hamas, we're going to see a new Palestinian version of ISIS emerge. And these guys will be more dedicated, more ruthless, more suicidal, right? And so the potential for an even worse type of uprising is in the ruins of Beirut and Gaza.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. To Raul's point, the Israelis have to have a plan. We have to have a plan. What's going to fill the voids being created? I agree with Raul. The problem of terrorism is not going to go away. Unfortunately, it's been with us for hundreds of years, right? The conflict in the region has been there for, go back to maybe the start of time, depending on who you ask. Yes, the PLO, the destruction of the PLO led to the creation of Hezbollah and Hamas, but part of that is just because poor policy was pursued, and it's maybe like our experience in Iraq. We better have a plan. You can't create a void and then not be ready to fill that void very quickly. And so the Israelis have to have a plan for Gaza. They have to have a plan for the Palestinians. Yesterday the president said that this was I think a great day for the Israeli people, the American people. I personally think for the with Sinwar's removal, for the Palestinian people, here's a guy that was willing to kill as many Palestinians as he had to achieve his objectives. Mm-hmm. There may be an opportunity here. I've said this too in Lebanon. The Lebanese people now have an opportunity with Hezbollah being decimated to take their country back. But people need to have a plan. And a well thought out plan, and then ready to execute that plan, the courage to actually take the steps to execute that. So whatever the next administration is going to be in the United States, whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans, they have to have a plan, and they have to be ready to execute that plan to fill these voids, because you'll probably have terrorist groups, smaller groups, but you don't want them to turn into another ISIS. I mean, of that magnitude. You don't want another Hezbollah fill in the void.
Rolf, Goff, and Glencorn, it's always a pleasure to get your insights in the region, because, as I mentioned off the top, the two of you have incredible experience there and perspectives that many of us don't. So I want to thank you again for sharing your views with us here at the World Deciphered and the Cipher Brief. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, take care, Glenn.
You probably already know that the Cipher Brief works with deeply experienced experts on global and national security to help put context around today's headlines. But did you also know that the Cipher Brief produces a daily report that keeps you up to speed on national and global security stories that are impacting businesses around the world? Like the President's Daily Brief, the Cipher Brief's open source report should be your first read of the day to stay ahead of the national and global security stories impacting your world. Become a subscriber and get the report for free. Subscribe at thecipherbrief.com.
Welcome back. Getting back to it now, according to the acting director of the National Counterterrorism Center, Brett Holmgren, since 7 October 2023, there have been at least 19 attacks and 21 disrupted plots in more than 20 countries, for which the Israel-Hamas conflict has served as a primary motivational factor, a contributing factor, or probable reason for target selection. The NCTC acting director speaking at the Cipher Brief Threat Conference also said there have been more than a dozen plots that were motivated at least partly by the Middle East conflict, adding that the Israel-Hamas conflict is emerging as the most consequential event impacting global terrorism in the last decade. Cipher Brief international correspondent Meurmishvili sat down on the sidelines of that threat conference with the former Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, Dr. Michael Vickers, to talk not just about the war in Gaza, but also how the broader regional instability is impacting and creating new challenges for U.S. security as terrorist groups adapt their tactics in response to shifting geopolitical dynamics.
Dr. Vickers, thank you very much for finding the time to talk to us today.
My pleasure.
Welcome to the World Deciphered.
Thank you.
Let's start the conversation from the DHS 2025 threats assessment.
Okay.
And based on that, to combine these two topics, based on that, where do you see the evolution of the terrorist threats?
So it's evolved significantly since 9/11 and pre-9/11. Pre-9/11, Al-Qaeda was a centralized single organization. And over the course of the next decade or so, it developed a number of franchises in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria, in North Africa, and then in the Indian subcontinent. And out of one of those groups, the Islamic State, or ISIS, emerged from Al-Qaeda in Iraq, essentially. And it also evolved from directed, planned attacks to inspired attacks, to taking advantage of new social media tools to radicalize people online without ever joining a group, to get them to do something in some country, drive a truck into people or stab them or do other things. Now, both of those groups, Al-Qaeda and ISIS, have been badly battered and do not have the capabilities today that they had in the past, but the root causes that gave rise to them haven't gone away. And so, and then the Gaza conflict and the victory of the Taliban, really our defeating ourselves, has inspired these groups that they, one, have greater grievances, or two, that if they wait long enough, they can win.
Based on that, you touched upon this a little bit in your response just now, but based on your experience, everything that you've done and monitored, do you see these threats, motivations, and maybe even methods of these terrorist groups evolve, change, or are they still the same?
So their methods have evolved some to take advantage of new technologies and then risks to their group's operation. So, I mentioned using inspired attacks, using social media tools to inspire jihadists globally. And they've also benefited from public encryption channels and things to make them harder to target. Their goals, particularly the global jihadist movement, really hasn't changed. They have a very, very long-term view, and their view is to, first take over portions of the Middle East, to knock the U.S. out of the Middle East, and then eventually, it's a very ambitious and many would say unrealistic goal, to then use that as a platform to conquer other areas, eventually the rest of the world.
And how do you think some of the global conflicts or regional conflicts that we're looking at right now, being it in the Middle East or even in Ukraine maybe, do you think these conflicts impact global security from the terrorism perspective?
Yeah, so there's a couple that I think are important. One, Gaza has really radicalized, re-radicalized, certainly global jihadists. Second, as I mentioned, the Taliban's victory in Afghanistan inspires them. And then there's these other effects of these other conflicts outside of the Middle East. So with Ukraine, or if there are war elsewhere, their hope is that it would distract the West from paying attention to them, and therefore they can grow stronger for a while without the focus being on them as it has been for the past 20 years. And then the final aspect, with the much more dangerous security environment of great power competition with China and Russia, and then even a regional power like Iran, they may resort more to state-sponsored terrorism. Iran has always been in that business, China really not, Russia in the Cold War, Soviet Union, but not now. But they could get back and see that as an instrument for them to weaken their main rival. It may not be the groups you see in the Middle East, might be others, but one can imagine that too. So we can't take our eye off the ball about the terrorism problem, even as it's evolving.
You mentioned technology and AI a couple times during this conversation already. So where does the AI and technological advancement since 2001, where does this advancement has put the U.S. counterterrorism strategies, operations, planning? Do you have any insight into that?
Well, on our side, technological innovation has been very important to be able to geolocate terrorist groups and then to be able to monitor them with full motion video and all sources of intelligence to fix them, as we talk about, and then with very precise weapons to strike them. And then the development of drone technologies were uniquely suited to that. So that's just a few of the big innovations. There have been others in signals intelligence and others. I talked about the impact of social media and cryptography on terrorist groups. They're now even getting into the AI business, where the capability to fake videos and make them look realistic, like look, we just had this great victory, something's burning, when really it's something altered from a fire, in South America or something, had nothing to do with terrorism.
Or somebody's statement that would be
or
fueling
somebody's
some
statement
of the grievances.
Modified exactly to fuel a grievance. So they're taking advantage of non-state actors are taking advantage of these technologies as much as great powers, in their own way.
Do you see any gaps in the U.S. strategy to tackle some of these challenges that are coming up now?
So the core principle and strategy for counterterrorism is, one, to distinguish between these global jihadist groups that really can threaten our national security in a big way from local groups and treat them more seriously. And then the core strategic principle is to deny them any sanctuary. This is the big mistake we made before 9/11, was to let this group gather up unmolested in Afghanistan and then have its tentacles in other parts of the world. Germany, for example, is where some of the 9/11 plotters came from. And so we built a much stronger partnership with our international partners after 9/11. But you don't want to make those mistakes again as this threat starts to rise. If we stay on top of it, we can keep it down, but we have to learn the lessons of the last 20 years.
You mentioned Germany. How important do you think the alliances are in this effort?
Well, it's really a worldwide partnership pretty much. So some of them have to do with allies, but a lot more has to do with partners, where we don't have formal alliances, but we have important intelligence relationships or security relationships and maybe aid programs or others with those governments. But that ability really extends our ability to, that network of partners and allies extends our intelligence ability to monitor these groups and disrupt their plots in the early stages.
This is my final question to you. The DHS threat assessment of 2025 talked about some of the concerns about domestic terrorism or domestic ground terrorism. What concerns you about that, and how big of an issue and challenge do you think that is?
So it's another feature of the environment right now, the growing domestic extremist threat. And some of that is white nationalists, a big chunk of it is, political violence is something that unfortunately affects democracies and republics from time to time. And, there's ways to deal with that, but we have to have the will to deal with domestic extremists who resort to, to violence. But then also that radicalization aspect, the connection between the domestic and the international. And I would add, it's not just the global jihadists. There's also connections between white nationalist domestic extremists and their cousins, in other countries. And so, and again, one can imagine a great power like Russia trying to take advantage of that here or in Europe or elsewhere with, ties to some of these groups.
Yeah. So, I guess it was not my last question.
Okay.
How optimistic or pessimistic are you about the way we're dealing with terrorism threats at this point?
I think right now I'm still optimistic because we did very well. There hasn't been another 9/11 attack. We've had our mistakes the past 20 years, but in the counterterrorism area, we've done way more right than wrong. And so what we don't want to do is go back to the pre-9/11 situation. And as long as we've learned the lessons of the past 20 years of what's worked and what hasn't worked, and then adapt it to the new situation, including domestic extremism or whatever, we'll be fine.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your
pleasure.
time and your thoughts. I really
pleasure.
appreciate this.
And that's it for this episode of The World Deciphered, brought to you by the Cipher Brief. I'm your host, Suzanne Kelly. Remember, you can find the full interviews with all of our guests at the Cipher Brief's YouTube channel, where I hope you'll also become a subscriber. And I hope you'll visit us at thecipherbrief.com all throughout the week as we keep you up to speed on what's happening in the world of global and national security. Check out our open source report, which many have told us rivals the president's daily brief in terms of content and focus on global threats. I'm Suzanne Kelly. We'll see you next time here on The World Deciphered.